from the point of view of the sailors who were locked in the TV room in the middle of the night, it's a terrifying situation. They have no idea what's happening. They hear the engines start up, which is not a good sign because they all know what happens if this ship makes it to Somalia. And then they hear gunshots. And even worse than that, they hear an explosion coming from deep within the ship and smoke starts pouring in through the grills. They recognize that this is about the worst situation they could be in. They're sitting on top of 1 million barrels of explosive liquid and the ship's clearly on fire.
I can't believe that modern day piracy is still a thing.
Yeah, I didn't really know much about it before I started down the road of doing this book. I just assumed that shipping was like everything else. The economy modernizes, the world gets bigger and more corporatized and generally safer. But that hasn't happened yet with shipping. It's still in some ways the same as it was back in the days when pirates were roaming the Caribbean. It's still kind of lawless around the edges. It's still dominated by very secretive, wealthy people. And it still does its business completely outside of the general public and law enforcement. And we just don't know what goes on out there. But it turns out there's a lot of crime happening, which is kind of the subject of the book.
Isn't it that 90% of the things that you see, 90% of pretty much everything has arrived by ship?
Yeah, that's right, Chris. It's the famous expression is 90% of everything. And that runs from your iPhone, your smartphone, your computer, through to a Barbie doll you bought for your daughter, through to some fresh fruit that's come in. It's all come by boat. It still works that way, and we're actually more reliant on ships than we have ever been in human history. It's so important.
It's interesting. I don't understand how such a fundamental industry, remembering what happened with the Ever Given when that blocked the Suez Canal and all hell broke loose for a couple of weeks. I don't understand how it's still such a cowboy industry. Is there something very particular about this industry that's causing it to have loopholes that people can take advantage of?
Yeah, there's a few things happening at once, really. I mean, the main one is the same story that it's always been, which is that governments and police forces and federal agencies, they only reach about 10 miles out off the shore of whatever country you're in. And out, once you go past that point, there is no law. Quite literally, that's the case. And so
is that actually true?
Well, I mean, technically, when you're on a ship, you're subject to the law of the flag that you're flying at the time. But the reality is that out at sea, if a crewman gets thrown over the side of a vessel, and his fellow sailors are threatened into silence, who's going to prosecute that crime? Which police force is going to bring the perpetrators to justice? It kind of falls in between the cracks of global law enforcement, and police and law enforcement agencies have a tough enough time dealing with all the shady crap that happens on shore. They just don't have the resources or the means to stretch out into the sea. And so, 150, 200 years ago, if you murdered someone and you wanted to escape justice, you could just board a tramp ship at your nearest port and go off to the New World, or go to Africa or Asia. And it's still a bit like that. It's just really difficult for law enforcement agencies to monitor what's happening at sea. So it attracts a certain kind of person.
I've got a friend, Michael Malice, who's a famous anarchist, and he always uses this example. He says, a Frenchman murders a Canadian in Mexico. Who investigates it?
Well, I mean, a good example of that problem is what happens when someone burns a Greek-owned oil tanker that is carrying 1 million barrels from Ukraine to China, is insured in London, and is carrying the flag of Liberia and owned by a shell company in the Marshall Islands. And it's funny. It's funny when you put it that way, but that literally is the quandary when an incident like that happens. Everyone sits around going, "Whose job is this?"
That's like one of those logic puzzles that you get in the back of the Telegraph.
Yeah.
Julie is Joanne's mother, and Katie is her sister. They have known each other for 45 years. How old is blah, blah? How many birthdays is it until the dog dies? So, all right, I talk to me about the fact, let's get the pirates, right? So you have this ship, which is trying to get from the Ukraine to China. It's got what's the value of the cargo?
The cargo is about $100 million. It's 1 million barrels of oil.
Okay.
So at the time, that's $100 million.
Would have been way more now.
Well,
Should have done it now. Should have bloody done it now. Talk to me about how pirates operate. Like, you've got this huge ship. Some people may have seen Captain, what was that film with Tom Hanks?
Captain Phillips.
Captain Phillips. It still kind of blows my mind that a little wooden boat with a couple of guys in sleeveless T-shirts and wooden guns are able to stop a huge tanker moving at full speed. What's their MO?
Captain Phillips is actually a great starting point for the way modern piracy works. And especially in 2011, this was the peak of Somali piracy, which is the kind that everyone's read about and seen movies about. There was an attack on a ship once every couple of days back in this period. It was rampant. And, the MO of the Somali pirates would be they had a skiff, which is a tiny little motorboat, quite quick, carrying maybe, 6 or 7 guys with guns and sandals and scruffy clothes. And they would be directed out to any large vessel they could find coming through the Gulf of Aden. And they would come alongside it, use grappling hooks to try and board, literally climb 30 or 40 feet up the side of these enormous vessels, and then wave their guns around, get into the bridge, and take the ship back to Somalian water, where it would be held until someone paid a ransom. And the crazy thing was that, these ransoms were paid. They were often paid. Not only would there be maybe 20 sailors whose lives would be at risk if the ransom doesn't get paid. A big cargo ship might be carrying $1 billion worth of cargo on its own, 20,000 containers that could be packed with laptops or whatever else. They just simply couldn't afford to have these vessels, sat off the coast of Somalia for months and months at a time. So they paid. I once spoke to a guy whose job it was to pay pirate ransoms, and he would sometimes literally take a small plane and fly over Somalia and drop suitcases of cash out the window. So this insane industry sprang up, and it was incredibly lucrative for the Somalis. So in 2011, the oil tanker in our story, the Brilliante Virtuoso, comes into this area. And of course, everyone on board is terrified because they've seen Captain Phillips, right? They've heard the stories of what happens to sailors when Somali pirates get on board. It's the middle of the night, and all the Filipino sailors on board are absolutely terrified that something's going to happen.
What's special about this place that they are in the water?
The Gulf of Aden. The Gulf of Aden just happens to be the part of the coastline of Somalia and of the Middle East, and it's at the entry point to the Suez Canal. So if you're coming from Asia and you're transiting the Suez Canal, which you have to do, otherwise it's like a 3,000-mile journey around the whole of Africa, you have to come through the waters off the coast of Somalia, and you have to get quite close. And this is a major world trade route. We saw that when the Suez Canal got blocked for a week, how bad it was for the whole world. There is no option but to transit Suez. So major vessels have to risk passing through this area. There's a few things that you can do to make it safer. Go very quickly would be one. A lot of vessels would go in naval convoys, so they'd have a big British or American or European destroyer escorting them through the area, which is going to put off any pirates. Sometimes they would carry armed guards. And the Brilliante Virtuoso decided it was going to pick up a security team off the coast of Aden, which is a Yemeni port. And so they had to just wait overnight, a few miles off the coast of Aden for these guys to arrive by boat.
That does seem a little bit like trying to fix the problem by hitting it with a big hammer. Like the very thing that you're trying to avoid by getting the security force on board is the thing that you're inviting by sitting there in the middle of the night.
This becomes important as the story progresses. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not the cleverest thing to do to wait in a heavily pirated area overnight, drifting without power. Not only that, but the captain decided to light all the lights of the Brilliante Virtuoso. So it was lit up like a Christmas tree. You could literally see it from 10 miles away. You can imagine how the crew felt just sitting out there waiting. What
security measures does a normal ship have? You don't have an escort with you. You're not moving quickly. Is there anything that they've got?
mostly they don't have guns or actual weapons. It's kind of legally problematic to shoot at people from a container ship or an oil tanker, let alone the moral question. So they don't normally have guns. But in the absence of that, and you see a bit of this in Captain Phillips, they have these powerful water hoses that are actually can blast these powerful streams of water at small vessels and can capsize them. The Brilliante ran barbed wire all the way around the outside of the vessel to make it harder for pirates to board. I think at one point they even had like a mannequin dressed up in sailor's gear propped up on the bridge to look like it was there was someone on watch even when there wasn't.
A pirate scarecrow.
Yeah, pirate scarecrow. It's basic and not terribly effective, it turns out.
How did they get on then?
So it was a strange incident. The crew of this ship are all Filipino, and there's a watchman. It's about coming up to midnight, and he's just finishing his shift, and he sees a small vessel approaching very fast. So he goes down and hails them, and he can see from the deck of the ship that this is a small boat carrying armed men wearing masks. They're carrying what look like AK-47 rifles. They're in strange sort of camouflage outfits, and they shout up that they're the security crew, that they've arrived. They're the security crew, and they've arrived and are ready to board. Now, as anyone would, looking down at these men with their masks and their AK-47, they don't look much like professional security operatives. And the guy on watch is really reluctant to let them on board. But, you know, he calls up to the captain in the bridge, and the captain's instructions are clear and immediate. Let them come on. So he lowers a ladder and literally invites them onto the ship. And they've been on board for no more than 2 or 3 seconds when they point their rifles at him and demand to be taken to see the captain.
Well, straight away there's something dodgy going on. How would they know that they were waiting for a security force? How would they know that would be a thing that they could shout up?
That's the big question. How would they know that there was a ship here waiting for security crew? You would have to have very specific knowledge. All
right, so what happens next?
So what happens next is this chaotic situation where you've got 7 or 8 armed men on board the ship. The Filipino crew are rounded up and locked in the television room. The captain and the chief engineer are taken away by these armed men. And from the point of view of the sailors who are locked in the TV room in the middle of the night, it's a terrifying situation. They have no idea what's happening. They hear the engines start up, which is not a good sign because they all know what happens if this ship makes it to Somalia. And then they hear gunshots. And even worse than that, they hear an explosion coming from deep within the ship, and smoke starts pouring in through the grills. So, you know, they recognize that this is about the worst situation they could be in. They're sitting on top of a million barrels of explosive liquid, and the ship's clearly on fire. So they decide to take a risk and get out of the TV room. So they get out of the room. The pirates have disappeared. And so they sort of inch their way up to the bridge, up the steps in complete darkness because the power's gone out. And they find the captain sort of hogtied on the bridge, waiting to be rescued.
Hang on a second. They've left. The pirates have left.
The pirates just upped and left. They disappeared.
They're supposed to take this back for ransom. That's their usual MO, right?
Yeah.
But they've left. The captain's there. Everybody's there. No one's been harmed. No one's been hurt. No one's been shot.
No, they just left. There was a mysterious explosion, and then they left. You can see why almost immediately people who had a financial interest in the ship were asking the question, what the hell happened here? This doesn't look like a normal...
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, so how do they get...
like a normal piracy attack.
How do they get saved? Is the ship still mobile at the moment?
No, it's dead in the water. It's just floating. There's a really serious fire happening now. And it's so hot they can feel the heat and they can hear the sound of the steel on the ship sort of warping and bending in the extreme heat, which is, you know, a really an awful sound to hear. But they do a couple of things. There's a security button on the bridge that they press, which alerts the local authorities and naval forces that there's a problem, and they issue a distress call, which is picked up by an American destroyer called the USS Philippine Sea, which is an hour or so away. And, you know, the Filipino guys say, Philippine Sea, we're under attack. Please come and help. And within the hour, the Americans are there. They've got a helicopter, and they're in a position to help out.
Right. So everybody gets picked up and taken away?
Yeah, they abandon ship. Everyone abandons ship. They get into the lifeboat and they're picked up and taken aboard this USS Cruiser. One of the individuals, the chief engineer, somehow is left on board, and he's on the ship for about 2 hours on his own in very strange circumstances. He later tells people he was just hiding from the pirates in the engine room. But at the crack of dawn, he sort of appears on deck waving a flag, and he jumps into the water and is picked up and taken away by the Americans as well.
Okay, what did the rest of the crew say? Was he not with them in the TV room? Was he somewhere else?
No. This is one of the strange things about what happened is he basically disappeared from sight for hours. He would later say that he was taken to the engine room to keep the engine running, and he managed to escape from the pirates and hide in a toilet, and then basically sort of skulked around for a few hours until the fire became so serious that he had to leave, and then he was rescued.
Everyone's so dodgy, and there's no one that isn't dodgy so far. Okay, Lloyd's of London are the people that are in charge of the sort of protection strategies for this, because there's a lot of different people who own the ship who want their money back for potential loss or wastage or the actual cargo that the ship's got on it. How do they get involved?
Well, so Lloyd's is the market where you buy insurance for anything big. If you want to launch a space rocket or carry 1 million barrels of oil from Ukraine to China or build a skyscraper, whatever it is, you can't do it. You can't get your bank loans without getting insurance. It's just impossible. It wouldn't happen. And so for anything really big, you go through Lloyd's. It's like 500-year-old market. It's been the biggest in the world for a long time, and it remains the biggest in the world. So that's the place you get your insurance from, and that's the place that connects all the different insurers to a ship like the Brilliante Virtuoso. So whenever something bad happens at sea, whenever there's an accident or a fire or a hurricane or whatever it is, Lloyd's has sort of an apparatus that kicks into action to start solving problems, start trying to rescue the vessel. It's a little bit similar to if your bathroom floods. Who do you call? The first person you call is your insurer. And then you talk to your insurer, and then the insurer negotiates someone to come out and first of all fix the problem, and then afterwards try and get some compensation to repair the damage. It's the same in shipping. Okay,
so who do Lloyd's send?
So initially, the first people on the scene are salvage experts. Salvage crews are like the emergency service of the ocean. They're these guys who roam around looking for shipping accidents, and they show up on the scene as fast as they can. And they're there to rescue a sinking ship. Essentially, they'll come on board, plug leaks, put out fires, rescue the crew. And the reason they do that is not because of that they're great guys and they're doing it from the kindness of their hearts. It's because if under sort of the maritime rules of the Lloyd's market and ocean-bound trade generally, if you manage to salvage a ship, you get anything up to sort of 10% of the value of what it's carrying. Now, if you imagine these days, a big ship might be carrying $1 billion worth. If you're a salvage crew and you get one of these ships that run aground and you're first on the scene and you rescue it, that's a huge payout. So it's a crazy, risky, dangerous, but very lucrative business. And the first guys that show up is this Greek salvage crew that are based in Aden. And so they start doing some basic firefighting.
The ship doesn't sink then?
It doesn't sink. No, the fire initially looks like it's gone out, and then there's an upsurge in the inferno. And the salvage crew spend a good couple of days doing firefighting efforts. So they're pouring water on board. They eventually board the vessel and try and look at the damage. And they're responsible for that ship while it's in the emergency situation.
Has there ever been a case where multiple salvage crews have arrived at a ship at the same time and they're competing for it? It sounds like, is it like finders keepers?
Yes, it is a bit like that. And because of the way salvage is, these are rough, sort of weather-hardened sailors. They're tough people. They have to be. It's that kind of game. And so it can be quite violent. There can sometimes be conflict between salvage crews if they show up at the same time. I've heard of guns being pointed to keep other salvage crews away. Sometimes salvage crews will sort of board a vessel that's in trouble and try and forcibly remove the chains from the other salvage crew so they can take control of it. It can get a bit nasty, but when you're talking about $50 million worth of rewards, you can imagine why they do that.
Yeah, it's a serious incentive, I suppose, to play dirty. So what about the investigation?
Yeah, so after you stop the flood in your bathroom, you need someone to come and assess the damage. You need an assessor, and it's the same with this gigantic ship. There's a dozen companies potentially facing a loss over this vessel, and what they need is an expert to go and first of all say, is this ship finished? Is it a total write-off? Can it be repaired and recovered? And what's the nature of the damage? What caused the damage? And so the person who does that job is called a marine surveyor. And it just so happened that in nearby Aden, there was a very experienced British guy called Captain David Mockett, who had been doing this job a long time. He was kind of famous in the port city because he was about 6'4". He was like by half a foot the tallest guy in the area, had this big booming laugh, huge personality. Everyone knew him. And he was the guy that you hire if you want a job done properly off the coast of Yemen. So the insurers quickly appointed him to go and get his boots on the deck and go and do a proper survey.
One fella for the entire boat, for the entire investigation.
Well, he's there in the first instance just to get aboard quickly to get an idea of the damage. Of course,
kind of like the crime scene photos, and then perhaps after that they can be assessed by a big team of people.
Exactly. So they would eventually expect to tow the ship somewhere much safer, and then there'd be dozens of people crawling all over it. But in the meantime, they need someone to take a look. And David Mockett is the guy they hire. He takes the fishing boat out. He manages to talk his way in with the Greek salvage crew. And he gets aboard the vessel, looks around. And like you say, he has a camera. He's taking pictures all the time. He takes hundreds of pictures of the twisted wreckage of the inside of the ship. And I think he can see early on it's completely destroyed. The ship will never be used again. It's damaged beyond repair.
What's happened then? The fires just got rid of some important parts of infrastructure?
The engine room is destroyed completely. It's just a black and sooty mess. And at that point, the cost of repairing it would be far more expensive than just scrapping it or buying a new ship. Okay. So it's a write-off.
Does he see anything suspicious?
Well, he's also looking for signs of how this fire started, because, as you pointed out, it's not very smart pirate behavior to burn your prize once you board a vessel. You've gone to all the trouble to get aboard. Why burn it and leave? So one of the theories that was going around and was being used to explain this was that they'd fired a rocket-propelled grenade, and that started the fire. So Mockett was looking for signs of a rocket-propelled grenade strike. He didn't find any. He was looking for signs of AK-47 fire. He didn't find much of that either. And so what he came away with was this confused sensation of, the evidence doesn't point to piracy. So what is it? And he has to return to Aden. He sends his reports back to London, and his photographs and all the evidence he's got. And his initial assessment is there's something strange about this incident. The local authorities are suspicious, and I'm going to need to dig further to find out more.
How much is the value of the ship?
That's an interesting question. The ship, for insurance purposes, the ship was valued at about $50 million.
Okay, that's still quite a hefty investment as well.
Yeah, but it was an old ship. It was towards the end of its life, and it wasn't in great shape. It was kind of a rusty wreck. So the actual value of the ship, if they tried to sell it, would be much less than that, maybe down to $10 million or below.
All right. So what happens to David next?
So he's back in Aden, and he's doing his job. He's talking to experts in the area. He's tapping up his local government sources. And a few days after his survey, he gets in his white Lexus to drive home for lunch. Gets a few yards down the street, and a car bomb that's been placed directly on his seat is detonated, which kills him instantly.
Pretty serious.
Yeah, it was an awful attack. I mean, at the time, the local media was saying, this is another terrorist attack. This is another one of these militant groups that operate on the Arabian Peninsula. And on the face of it, that seemed like a plausible explanation. But as soon as you look a bit more closely at the way he was killed, it doesn't make sense. The bomb wasn't a sort of large-scale destructive device designed to maim and cause terror. It was a very specific, targeted TNT remote detonated device. It was used, the sort of device they use in Yemen for political assassination. So that didn't fit with the sort of terrorist MO. And then another big problem was in the immediate aftermath, no terror group claimed it. Now, in Yemen, as in elsewhere, when a Westerner is killed, when a British or American person is killed, the terror group behind it wants the world to know they've done it. That's why they do these attacks in the first place. But no one claimed it. And so, it started to look like he'd been killed for another reason, that he'd been targeted specifically for another reason.
Is there anything interesting about Yemen or the structure there? Is because Somalia doesn't have a single government, right? That's kind of still basically up for grabs by whichever person's the most ruthless.
Yeah.
What's Yemen like?
Yemen back then was under the dictatorship of a guy called President Saleh, who was, a fairly bog standard developing world kleptocrat. He ran this sort of corrupt network of cronies who made billions of dollars from the poorest country in the Middle East. It wasn't as chaotic as it's since become, but at this particular moment, it was the country was on the cusp of civil war. It was the start of the Arab Spring. So all these uprisings against corrupt dictatorships that started in Tunisia and spread across the Middle East had arrived in Yemen, and there were massive street protests. And President Saleh, reacted the way that dictators often do, which is to send in troops and open fire on peaceful protesters. So the situation in Yemen was chaotic and complicated, for sure, and it's definitely got worse since.
Who investigates David's death then?
In the first instance, it's the job of the Yemeni police. The local Yemeni CID is their job. But because this is a British citizen, and because President Saleh purportedly has good relations with European countries and the US, the British cops decide to send one of their detectives over to liaise with the Yemeni colleagues. Now, of course, this guy, Jonathan Topman, he doesn't have jurisdiction to investigate in Yemen, but he's there to offer assistance and I guess to try and sort of find out as much information as he can for the British government and for Mockett's family. So he goes out and sort of joins the investigation.
Does he find anything interesting?
Yeah, so we know about Jonathan Topman's work because at an inquest into David Mockett's death a few months later, he comes and he explains what he did in Yemen and why. I guess the picture that emerges is of an investigation that doesn't really do anything you would want police investigators to do. There's no sort of forensic assessment of the crime scene. David Mockett's laptop is destroyed and is never recovered, and they refuse to release it to the British police. There's no serious investigation of who potentially might want to hurt David Mockett and why. The whole thing is kind of, seems to be for show. But Jonathan Topman does learn one interesting thing, which is he's having dinner one night with some Yemeni policemen, and they share their feelings about what's happened. And they say, no, they don't think this is terrorism. They think that David Mockett has been murdered because of his job, that he's been murdered because of some corrupt scheme to extract money from the shipping insurance industry, and that was the reason for him to be targeted. It was a criminal act. And so Topman takes this information back to the inquest and he shares it with the Mockett family and the wider world. It's reported in the British press. And so now you have this insane situation where an oil tanker has been attacked and burned in what looks increasingly like a fraud. The one person sent to investigate and find out the truth has been murdered by unknown criminal actors. And what happens next? Well, nothing happens. There's no British police investigation. There's no pressure on the Yemeni government. Yemeni descends further into chaos and civil war. There's no criminal investigation into whatever insurance fraud might have happened. Everything gets sort of clogged up in the administrative machine of the Lloyd's of London insurance market.
Well, why does anything start moving then? If everything's clogged up and everything's going slow and ground to a halt, why does something begin to pick back up?
Well, the main reason for that is that the ship owner files an insurance claim at Lloyd's. The Greek ship owner files a claim, and the value of that claim rises to over $100 million, or in the region of $100 million, because this guy is claiming not only for the value of the ship that's being destroyed, he's also claiming for lost profits and interest. And so the number keeps ticking up, and it becomes this enormous...
because the ship is not being used, and by not having the ship, he's losing business, losing more business.
Exactly. So the number keeps ticking up, and it becomes so large that it's kind of hard to ignore. Now, even at Lloyd's of London, the world's largest insurance market, where, I don't know, I think they pay out something like $200,000 every hour or some insane sum. There's vast pools of capital out there, almost unlimited. $100 billion over one ship is still an enormous amount of money. So the insurers really have no choice but to dig a little deeper. And they have the good fortune to hire a legal team who use these investigators, these two former policemen from the Met Police in London, who now do private work for the insurance industry and others. And these two guys are brought in by the lawyers to do deeper investigation into what happened to the ship. And, they have the mentality of crime fighters. They see something that to them looks like a criminal act, and their motivation is to solve it. At the same time, they're aware of what happened to David Mockett. They meet Mockett's family, his widow, and they see a kind of travesty of justice. And so they become highly motivated, not just to solve the problem of this $100 billion insurance claim, but also to get to something that looks like justice.
They're the heroes of the story then so far.
In as much as this story has heroes.
But they're the only two, between them and that Topman guy, they're the only three people that haven't been dodgy yet. Everybody else is either dead or dodgy.
They would probably dispute the characterization of them as heroes, but I definitely think when this incident happened, the various actors reacted in different ways. Some were motivated by politics, some were motivated by money. There are very few people who made decisions based on integrity, which is, I've seen something happen here and it's wrong. A really good guy was murdered. He left behind a wife and daughters and grandchildren. And I don't want to be part of that. Very few people made a moral decision about what to do next, apart from our two investigators, who were Richard Veal and Michael Connor, to the point where they would be giving presentations in the Lloyd's of London market. They'd go to these glitzy office buildings in a room full of lawyers and insurance executives, and they would bring up on the screen a picture of Mockett's burnt-out car, just to remind everyone, this isn't just an insurance contract. This isn't just a dollar dispute. A guy was murdered here. A really good man was murdered, and we need to do something about it.
What's happening with the investigation into the boat after Mockett dies? Because he was the first person on the scene, but presumably there was subsequent investigations done after that were more forensic.
Yeah, the ship was towed up to the United Arab Emirates and was inspected by various agencies, including the insurers. The U.S. Navy's crime scene investigators unit showed up and had a look around. They were concerned that pirates might now if they were blowing up oil tankers that were passing through the Middle East. That's something the Navy wanted to know about too. So the ship was picked over, but the fire is a wonderful way of hiding evidence. The ship was so badly damaged, there wasn't really much left for them to look at. They found some kind of suspicious dents that looked like an explosive device had been detonated. But that was really the extent of the evidence. After that, the ship was sold for scrap, and it went off to the place where ships go to die, which are these sort of semi-legal shipbreaking yards in Pakistan and India, where they get driven up onto the beach and picked apart by hand, and all the metal bits taken away and sold. And so, the ship was literally torn to pieces. The evidence was gone.
Presumably, the barrels of oil must have been taken away and put onto some other ship to transport it away.
Yeah, they managed to. One of the salvage crews managed to salvage the oil. They siphoned it off onto another ship, as you say, and that was taken away. But that still left a very large insurance claim for the ship itself, which was damaged beyond repair. But the problem they had, like I say, is the evidence was gone, destroyed or burnt or scrapped. There was lots of expert opinions about the cause of the fire and lots of sort of legal back and forth about the various debts of the ship owner. But what they were lacking was, really clear evidence that a crime had taken place. What they needed was to speak to people who were on the vessel at the time, who were around in the immediate aftermath, who might actually be able to say, here's what happened to the ship. Here was the cause of the fire.
Who's this dodgy Greek salvage guy then? How does he come into it?
Vasilios Virgos is his name. He was I told you about the salvage crew that arrived really quickly from Aden on the Yemeni coast, and Vasilius Fergus is the guy who runs that salvage outfit, which is called Poseidon Salvage. Now he's a whole other character. He's a former Greek Navy diver. He was in the Greek Navy's elite diving school, and he was badly injured in a diving accident. I think he got the bends, and it left him with a lifelong limp and a bad temper. And he's made this strange life for himself in Yemen. He basically lives on a rusty salvage barge, doing bits and bobs for various Yemeni projects. But he's famously got a bad temper. So he's first on the scene, and he gets to the Brilliante Virtuoso in like 4 hours from nearby Aden, which is astonishingly fast. I mean, like, he was on the scene so quickly that he must have woken up immediately on getting the call, started his engines, and bolted straight for the ship, like a remarkable feat of efficiency. But there's lots of questions about him. The first one being, well, how did he know to be ready in the middle of the night in Yemen? How did he get there so fast? He has one of these characters that investigators look at and they see his track record, and they maybe he's not in the elite ranks of salvage crews. He's not. There's a famous Dutch company that are famous all over the world. He's kind of on one of the lower rungs of the ladder. He's got one of these ramshackle operations.
Who's the other Greek guy? That Super Mario guy? That's not the same person, is it?
No. So Super Mario was the guy who owned the Brilliante Virtuoso. He's the big tycoon. He's got a fleet of tankers and container ships that he operates around the world, and he's part of the Greek shipping class, which is to say that he's very rich. He lives in Greece, pays almost no tax, and he lives this kind of life of Bond villain luxury, running his fleet. His particular hobby is racing cars. He's a rally driver, and he's actually quite good. He does competitive racing around Greece, and he'll win competitions. He's a good driver, and racing rally cars was always his first passion. But he sort of fell into the family business of running a fleet. And he's a relatively prominent character in Greece. I mean, he owns the main fast ferry line between the mainland and the holiday islands. So anyone who's been sort of boating around Greece may well have been on one of his vessels. The company is called Sea Jets. So he has this big reputation, and it turns out that he's the owner of the Brilliante.
Risk taker.
Yes.
Adrenaline junkie guy.
Yes.
Mixed with disgruntled 1.5-legged Greek salvage owner.
Yes.
Again, we're just continuing to add more and more dodgy people to this list.
Yeah.
Didn't some dude from Lloyd's say that this had happened before at the funeral? Didn't he tell the wife that it had happened before?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things the investigators ran into early was, although it may be hard to believe, sometimes the Lloyd's of London insurance market doesn't know who owns the ships they're insuring. All they see is a brass plate company name with a generic title, but they might not know who the beneficial owner is. So the first job they had in the aftermath of the attack was to find out who actually owned the Brilliante. And the insurance guys didn't know. They thought it was some other entity. And then they discovered it was Marios Iliopoulos. And then there was immediate name recognition. They knew that name. The reason they knew his name was that another ship owned by him had got into trouble only a few miles away a couple of years earlier. It had mysteriously, there'd been a fire on the bridge. It had run into a sandbank, and the salvage operation had gone disastrously wrong, and the ship ended up splitting in two like a watermelon. And the other thing that caught the investigators' attention was that it was exactly the same salvage crew who arrived with remarkable speed from Aden to help out. It's our old friend Vasilius Vergos, the limping Greek diver. So he's on the scene as well. So you've got same ship owner, same salvage crew, and remarkably, the chief engineer, the Filipino chief engineer, was the same on both voyages as well.
The one that stuck about for 2 hours.
So yeah. So, one unfortunate accident off the coast of Yemen is bad luck. 2 is probably something else.
Dude, I can't believe it's so ridiculous how sort of flagrant and blatant the dodginess is. All right, so what happens next? It seems like all of the pieces at least start to come together, but presumably the investigators, other than coincidence, the investigators don't really seem to have much to tie people together yet.
They don't have a lot of physical evidence, no. And they're also battling against this kind of institutional complacency that you get in the City of London, in lots of industries, to be fair, but also in the insurance industry, where, Lloyd's of London has been running for 500 years. For 500 years, it's been a reliable source of income for the British middle and upper classes, the elites of London life. They quietly make tons of money at Lloyd's. They would much prefer to do so without any fuss or attention. And it's a great business for them to be in. They get to go to the pub for lunch, and they have wonderful bespoke suits, and they have this sort of privileged existence, and they're not very incentivized to look closely at the nasty criminal parts of the shipping industry. There's just no reason for them to do it. You might imagine that if there's fraudulent insurance claims being made, it would be expensive for them to pay, and so they wouldn't pay them, they would fight. But actually, the reverse is true. It's actually, in most cases, a lot easier just to pay to make these problems go away, and then pass the cost on to the customers by raising your premiums, which is what Lloyd's has been doing for hundreds of years.
It sounds like the shipping industry, that the dodginess is so endemic that what are you going to do? You're going to fight this one guy? Well, what about the next guy? And what about the next guy? Every single one of the claims that could be made is going to come from someone that has a shell company in Bermuda. And didn't you say that most of the company, like each boat, is owned by a single company? Yeah,
it's a single ship system. It's partly the scale of the problem, but also, unfortunately, fraud and criminality has kind of been built in to the cost structure of the Lloyd's of London insurance market. They know it happens. They know that it's expensive, and they tolerate it. They figure that, let's say 1 in 50, I'm making this number up.
Yeah.
Let's say 1 in 50 ship casualties isn't an accident. It's been done on purpose to get the insurance money. They figure it's simpler just to pay that 1 in 50 and keep doing what they've been doing, rather than go through big, expensive legal battles, rather than go through all the terrible publicity of accusing a customer of fraud, and rather than actually facing up to the fact that there's this really nasty criminal underworld that's kind of attached itself to the shipping business. So rather than do any of those things, they just pay, and they keep doing what they've always been doing. So, our two investigators in this story, Richard Veal and Michael Connor, they constantly encounter this reluctance to go and get the answers they need. They are prevented from doing the investigation they want to do. They're not allowed to interview the crew. As crazy as that sounds, they weren't given access to the crew. There are a load of sources that they identify who might have information about how the ship was attacked. They are prevented from going to do that, and the situation becomes really tense and kind of conflicted, where they're fighting against their own legal team and saying we need to do more.
They've been brought in by Lloyd's of London, though, so it does seem that Lloyd's of London felt like, presumably they can't bring in this level of investigation for every one of these. If you've said that it's easier for Lloyd's to pay out, it seems like they've maybe got something in the side of their minds that's made them think, there's something up here. Let's bring these grizzled old Met officers in to come and do a bit of work.
I'd love to tell you that the thing that made this exceptional was that David Mockett was murdered. And there may be some truth in that, but the evidence doesn't necessarily point that way. The evidence just points to the fact that once this claim reached a certain size, once they were on the hook for a certain sum of money, they decided it was time to fight, because they didn't want to just pay. And their own lawyers have written in legal filings that they would have been happy to settle this case had the sum of money not being so large.
Wow. Okay, so what happens next?
So next, it's full speed ahead in this lawsuit between the Greek ship owner and the Lloyd's of London insurers, and things get really messy and dangerous quite quickly. The ship owner, Super Mario, is incredibly hostile to any attempt by the insurers to get information out of him. He isn't handing over evidence. Hard drives full of emails go missing. It all becomes quite threatening. And this is where I entered the story, because at the time I was covering the courts in London, and I'd sort of become aware of the Brilliante Virtuoso incident, and I happened across on the court lists one day, seeing the name of the company that owned the ship in one of the big courts in London. I just turned up, and what I stumbled into was Super Mario, the ship owner, had been summoned by a London judge to give evidence in the case. And I've been to hundreds and hundreds of commercial trials. I've never seen anything quite like this. He was bellicose and angry and belligerent, waving his finger. At one point, he threatened the English lawyers. You just don't see these things in the rarefied sort of world of London law. It was frankly very entertaining and a little amusing. And then at the end of this 2 days of incredibly fraught cross-examination, he walks out of court and is arrested by the City of London police for fraud, accused of fraud. Well, he's arrested on suspicion of a fraud against the Lloyd's of London insurance market.
Oh, so for this wasn't him getting picked up for something else. This is him getting picked up for this, right? This
is for the Brilliante Virtuoso. And so I've walked into this mad situation where there's a simultaneous, very hostile lawsuit and criminal investigation, and this remarkable character of a ship owner. And that's where I sort of pick up the story. It takes a good few months after that to sort of unravel what's happening, because all that I've told you so far is happening behind closed doors in the City of London. So it took us quite a while to get up to speed on exactly who Super Mario was.
Where did you do your investigation then? How did you get any of this information from behind closed doors?
Well, it took about 4 or 5 years of talking to people mainly. We did about 150 interviews. We compiled loads of documentation. The lawsuit helped, because anytime there's a lawsuit, you get a sort of backbone of documentary evidence that's relatively reliable. But the lawsuit didn't deal with a lot of things we wanted answers to. We wanted to know more about David Mockett's life and death. We wanted to know more about the sailors on the ship and what their experience had been like. So we had to take what had been done so far and try and push it forward and go to places the police hadn't been, go to places the insurance investigators couldn't go, and get the answers no one else could.
What ended up happening with Super Mario then? Was he released back to Greece?
Super Mario was released without charge. He no commented his interview, didn't give him any information. They searched his room, but no, they let him go, and I don't think he'll ever come back to London.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then David's death, has anyone been charged with that?
No one's ever been charged with David Mockett's death, unfortunately, which is a continuing source of pain for his widow. If you can imagine losing someone in your life that you really care about, that's hard enough. Devastated his family. They were just about to retire as well, and she'd spent her whole life away from David. He'd been at sea or working in ports around the world for their whole married life together. And he was just about to retire, and they were going to finally spend some time together. So she's been left with this terrible hole in her life. But I think it's been made worse by the fact that there's been no reconciliation. There's been no attempt to punish the act of murder. In fact, if anything, for a few years afterwards, the whole thing was completely forgotten about, and no one wanted to talk about it. No one even paid her a visit. The insurance companies that hired David Mockett never once contacted her to say anything, let alone apologize or, offer her something by way of an explanation. So that makes the grief a lot harder to process, I think, because there's this unresolved pain that she's never been able to get over.
Is there an insurance policy for people like Mockett going out to dangerous countries?
There was, but his local employer in Yemen did a runner, and she never got any of that money. Yeah.
Oh my God!
Isn't insurance a funny thing?
No, it's not. It's just tragic. It's not funny in the slightest. Okay, so Super Mario's back in Greece. He's been released without charge after no commenting. David Mockett's death hasn't been investigated, and evidence will have been frittered away. It's in a country with even worse sort of political standing than it was 11 years ago when all of this happened.
Yeah.
Has the payout to Super Mario's company been agreed yet, or is that still ongoing?
So the one thing that has been resolved in all this mess is what happened to the Brilliante Virtuoso. And, after a very long and tetchy trial, a High Court judge in London ruled that the ship had been deliberately burned by members of the Yemeni Coast Guard who had been hired by Marius Iliopoulos and his associates, including Vasilius Virgos, the limping salver, in a sort of pre-planned act of insurance fraud where Super Mario was short of money. He was desperately short of cash. The Brilliante was hemorrhaging losses for him, and he needed a way to get rid of his ship. And they came up with this kind of harebrained conspiracy where they were going to make it look like a pirate attack, but hire some guys to come on board and start a fire and wreck the ship. They very nearly got away with it, and they chose wisely in terms of the location for their fraud because they did it in Yemen. Yemen is an impossible place for anyone to operate. It's been in a brutal civil war for years. It's had outbreaks of cholera and COVID, Saudi bombs falling all the time. They chose very cleverly, which is probably the reason most of the perpetrators have escaped justice. In fact, all of the perpetrators have escaped justice. But importantly, for our understanding of what happened, the judge found that, yes, it was a conspiracy. Yes, it was done at the behest of Super Mario. Yes, Vasilius Virgos was involved. And so we got a little bit closer to the truth.
How did he know that it was Coast Guard repurposed as pirates?
So I think to answer that question, you have to look at how crime works on an international sort of complicated level. And when you're talking about transnational crime, drug running, people smuggling, there are sort of loosely affiliated international networks of criminals. The Italian mafia will be loosely affiliated with the Irish mob and the Colombian cartels, and they're not sort of locked together in an ironclad conspiracy. They work with each other when it's financially beneficial to do so.
Friendships
they fight
of convenience.
With each other. Yeah, and so the Greek criminal cartel that arranged the attack on the ship and profited from it had local fixers in Aden, and one of them was Vasilius Virgos, this incredible character who teamed up with a local businessman, and they managed to get access to the local power structure in Yemen. And of course, back then in Yemen, probably as now, it's not very difficult to get access to the local power structure if you're willing to throw some money around. So it wasn't actually very difficult for them to find Yemeni Coast Guard members who are willing to do a job for a bit of extra cash.
Has Vasilius been charged?
No, he's never been charged with a crime. I should say that although he doesn't exactly deny the allegations against him, we are the only ones, as far as I know, who have ever spoken to him about it. We managed to reach him by phone shortly before the book was finished. As far as I know, he's still in Greece.
What's he like? What's he like to speak to?
Well, let me tell you this. When we sent him by text a list of sort of bullet points of the things that we were about to publish in our book, this is sort of standard journalistic practice. You're going to write something about someone, they should have a right to know, they should have a right to reply. So we did this process, and we sent him a text, and his reply was a smiling, crying with laughter emoji, which sort of tells you something about his attitude to sort of allegations of criminality and wrongdoing. Didn't seem to be overly concerned about them. He didn't engage much more than that, quite frankly. He didn't really engage with all the evidence against him and what was said by the London judge. All he would say to us was, "This is ridiculous. How would I know?" And all the evidence has been made up by people who are trying to blackmail me. And then he sort of cut off contact.
So where's the investigation at now, and what do you think is going to happen in the sort of near future?
Well, the sort of cause of Cynthia Mockett has been picked up by her local MP in Devon, who's raised it in the Houses of Parliament, and he called it a travesty of justice. And he asked the question of the Justice Minister, the head of the Justice Department, what are we going to do about this? And I think the police's attitude is that it's not our job to investigate a murder in Yemen. And of course, they're right about that. They have no jurisdiction to go over to Aden and start throwing people in the back of police vans. But the point of Cynthia Mockett and of Michael Connor, actually, the investigator who's been helping her, is that you don't need to prosecute that crime. You can treat this as a financial crime. You can do what they did to Al Capone, right? They got him on his taxes. Treat this as an act of maritime piracy and an act of insurance fraud, and then you can start to bring charges. But no one's been willing to do that. And I think it's clear the British police see it as too difficult and too problematic to pursue a case. But it's not too late. As this MP pointed out, the evidence is still there. Someone could pick this up and pursue it from a law enforcement point of view. It would just take a little bit of will and bravery. So it remains to be seen whether that'll happen.
And the money to Super Mario wasn't paid out. Or is that case been finished now with Lloyd's?
The lawsuit is ended, and it ended up as kind of like a Pyrrhic victory for the insurers because they won the case. Technically they won the case. The judge found that they didn't have to pay on the insurance claim because it was a fraud. But they didn't actually win in any real sense because Super Mario managed to extricate himself from the legal process because he refused to hand over evidence, because he basically didn't play the game of London litigation the way you're supposed to. He just cut himself off from the process. His claim was thrown out, but he had an existing insurance policy that from his bank. His lenders who lent him money to buy the boat had their own insurance policy. So they continued the case against the London insurers. So the lawsuit ended up as insurer versus insurer, which group of insurers were going to pay for the damage to Brilliante Virtuoso. Super Mario got away. And basically, what he had at the start of this was an aging, rusting, useless, money-losing oil tanker. He burned it. And he had about $60 million in loans to cover the cost of that oil tanker. He burned his own ship. He was freed from his loans. His debt went to zero on the ship. And he was also freed of his money-losing ship. So by some standards, you could say he's won. He's probably at least tens of millions of dollars better off than he would have been if he hadn't sunk his own ship, which is one of the crazy things about this story. One of the things that still blows my mind.
Yeah, I can't believe it. This story is insane. Kit, dude, congratulations on the lengthy and very impressive investigation. The book's great. The story's fantastic. If people want to keep up to date with the stuff that you do or your further investigation with regards to the story, you did a great piece on the Ever Given and what that caused as well. Where should they go to keep up to date with your work?
You can follow me on Twitter at Kit Chellel. Like any vain journalist, I post all my stories on there. And check out Dead in the Water. Look, Father's Day is coming up. If you know someone in your life who loves sort of crazy yarns about life on the open sea, this is definitely one of those. I've been doing this job a long time, and I've never seen anything quite like this.
Chris, I appreciate you. Cheers.
Thanks, man.
What's happening, people? Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that episode, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few weeks. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.